Good evening, British and American culture class. I'm going to start this lecture off by just explaining briefly what happened on Thursday. Some students realized that the cyber lecture was open at midnight and remained open until the quiz started at 10 in the morning. The reality is that I didn't share the Google Forms link until 9:45, as I explained in the email. Everybody should have gotten the email and seen it, so you don't need to send me any more emails telling me about what happened. I realize it. I actually thought that there were some people cheating because of the timing and everything, but it was actually my mistake. So I added the link at 9:43, I think. So anybody who was sitting there looking at the CNU portal beforehand saw the link appear early. And you're still, anybody who just went in at 10 o'clock and did the quiz normally, your quiz will be accepted. And I can see by the timestamp that you logged into the CNU portal and accessed it. When you accessed it, if there's more than a 10-minute difference, I can't accept your quiz because you could have spent 20 minutes or 25 minutes on the quiz. So if you logged in at 10 o'clock and you wrote your quiz and handed it in, there's no problem. If you logged in early and handed it in, a few students logged in at 9:47 and then 5 minutes later finished their quiz. And unfortunately they did it again so I deleted the second attempt. But there's various things that people did. But as long as you just used a 10-minute window between your access of the CNU portal and the form itself, then I consider it a valid quiz. And if you didn't, then you were taking advantage of a mistake by the professor, and I'm going to delete your quiz. Not delete it, I'm just not going to count it. So that's how it's going to be handled. But for the people who were confused and were not trying to cheat, I recognize that's what happened. We're going to have to do another quiz. The only way to solve this mistake is to just do another quiz that goes smoothly. As I said in my email, I'm not familiar with the CNU portal system and the campus management. I've been trying to do it myself rather than phone the secretary or go into the department office and figure it out. And that's one of the reasons I use my own website for this stuff. So I made an error and I didn't set the time correctly. And that's what happened. So I'll make sure that things are working properly for quiz number 7 this upcoming week. So that'll be December 3rd, the same day that we have a Zoom lecture, the same day that your final assignment is due. Everything's going to wrap up on the same day. Since we have Zoom lectures at 10 o'clock in the morning and 11 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, I will need you to do the quiz at 9:45 until 9:55, and then log into Zoom and join me right after you finish the quiz. And if your time is at 11 o'clock, then you will have to join the Zoom meeting at 11 and just take a 1-hour break until we're ready for you. So that's how that went, and that's the explanation. Today, the topic is the American century. We're finally in the 20th century, where I was alive from 1981 until 2000. I turned 19 as the millennium began. But for you, freshmen especially, you were born in 2001. So you missed this. But basically your whole life has been affected by the things that happened, especially in America, but things that happened all over the world. The world we live in today is a direct result of the things that happened, the events that are important in shaping the America of the 20th century. And that's part of the reason that I'm here as a guest lectured in the first place, is because British and American culture have had a global influence, and this is what we're trying to understand better in this class. That's the number one reason to take this class, because why are we speaking English anyway? These hopefully will be some of the reasons, help you understand why we are. It's not a good thing or a bad thing necessarily. That's your opinion and you can have it. But I want to explain how it came about. And these things are the things that the events that line that up. I've chose the name the American Century because midway through the American century, the 20th century, in the middle of the Second World War, Henry Luce decided to run a Time magazine article that declared that it was the American century. Now, that was in the 1940s, so the century was already half over, but looking backwards, they could tell that there was a steep rise in American power. And looking backward, it was clear that British influence was on the decline globally compared to that of, not that it disappeared completely, but that it was slipping, and that America's power was rising. We talked about this way back in Queen Elizabeth's day. Now when we look back at Queen Elizabeth, we look at the beginning of the British Empire. But at the time, nobody was calling it the British Empire. That didn't really happen until the late 18th century, right? We talked about lots of stuff after the Industrial Revolution took root, and really after America separated, that's when the British Empire took off, after 1776, which is only a few lectures ago, not 6 weeks ago when we talked about Queen Elizabeth. But looking backward, you can tell that things were lining up to give, the English, and then once they unified with the Scottish, the British, a jump on all the other cultures in the world. And this is what happens to America as we enter the 20th century. So the first thing in chapter 7, because that's where we are, you go in your textbook and you look, first topic there is about modernism and what is referred to as the seminal tragedy, which is World War I. Now, there's lots of endless books and perspectives about the significance of World War I and why it happened and what happened and how it could have been avoided and all that sort of thing. But essentially, all of the the great powers of Europe had made alliances with each other. And when a young man assassinated Archduke Ferdinand, the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that triggered, a conflict between the Serbians and against the Austrian Empire as they attempted to suppress these Serbian terrorists, who had killed their future leader. And as a result of that, Russia threatened to fight against Austria to assist Serbia. And if Russia assisted Serbia, then Germany was going to join Austria to fight Russia. And if Germany did that, then France was going to, of course, declare war on Germany. And in order to attack France first, to get the jump on them, Germany went through Belgium. And Belgium, they said, let us go through your territory, and the Belgians refused. And so the Belgian army fought against the Germans, and the Germans crushed it. And when they did that, Belgium was essentially a neutral country defending itself, and that resulted in the United Kingdom jumping in. It's a domino effect, essentially. Like one thing went down, and then the whole thing the whole network of alliances got triggered, and everybody was sort of preparing for this conflict anyway, so they all mobilized, and the result was the most catastrophic event in human history until that point. And only World War II would be worse. So some of the reasons that this happened is because the Industrial Revolution was maturing and getting through another phase. Machines were getting faster, more reliable, more powerful. Dynamite had been invented, TNT and explosive shells, and airplanes were invented. They weren't used at the beginning of World War I. A lot of these things were still not military, they were still experimental, and they weren't really military weapons. They had potential to do a lot of things, but they hadn't been developed. But as soon as these countries started fighting, they basically turned their countries into military industrial complexes that developed competed with each other to get more and more powerful weapons, and that's why it was so destructive. Modern warfare is basically it's been described as a meat grinder, essentially, that you're throwing soldiers into battle, and there's so much damage, there's so much flying metal, explosions and weapons and people and machines, that it's just a nightmare. It's a nightmare is what it turned out to be. So modernism is this idea that human beings have had replaced religion, essentially, with an idea that progress was inevitable and it was beneficial, and that human beings could use science and technology and effort and industrial power and to manage and increase productivity, make things faster. Movement is a large part, and power and machinery and science. These are all concepts that underlie the idea of modernism, and this is what we're living in a postmodern era, you could say. We have all these digital and information elements, but when I talked about the transportation revolution and the railroads, of course, not very many of us ride locomotives and use steam engines anymore, but there wasn't anything like that before, and that was a modern idea, to have a machine take you down a track from one end to the other, using a power source. That's a totally different thing than riding a horse or being carried in a carriage that is drawn by horses, or walking, or any other sort of movement, even a ship. Ships have existed for thousands and thousands of years, but a steam-powered locomotive was a brand new thing. So now we've changed, we have gas-powered everything, and now we have electric cars and that sort of thing, but it's a vehicle, right? It's a vehicle that's powered, that has an engine, and it uses a fuel source to move somewhere. And we've just added all of this technology to it, but the bare bones thing is a modernist idea. So modern people, the Victorians were sort of, like I said, they had one foot still in the medieval, one last toe, maybe you might say, in the medieval. They were hanging on to morality and religious values and some other things like aristocracy, wealthy people being the privileged ones who are running government, and it wasn't a true democracy yet in England and that sort of thing. And the British, they had an empire still, but these were sort of all ideas that were kind of breaking down and fading away. And that the financial and industrial and transportation, all of these systems, capitalism, economic systems, were taking over and causing those sort of old systems to fall apart. You could look at World War I as the conflict, the final death of all of these old systems. For example, when they go in to fight in World War I, the French army, some people are still riding horses, and they have bright blue uniforms, and they have, red markers on, red feathers in their hats and that sort of thing, like Napoleon's army. Napoleon's army, they had fancy uniforms, they called the Hussars or whatever, and they have these big tall black hats, and they've got all this, all these fancy uniforms and everything. And that is that's not a modern way of fighting. What you would see the Germans do very early in World War I was they had a gray uniform, and and helmets. They had spikes on them at first, but they had metal helmets, not feathered caps that could just get blown off easily. Their uniforms were functional. They were camouflaged. People started wearing dark green and dark gray, and later in different terrains they would wear clothes that sort of matched the background. And instead of riding a horse straight in at somebody, they would move like soldiers do in computer games now. If you just run in there with a bright colored uniform and a big hat, you're going to get shot immediately. So you have to sneak around from object to object. You know, all of you, especially guys, but girls too, I know, these days play computer games. You got to sneak around, and that's how you fight. But that's not the way they fought. Traditional fighting wasn't like that. You didn't fire and move. You didn't shoot and then run to another object and hide, and then pop out and shoot. That's all modern developments. But at the beginning of the war, armies were not adapted to this. They weren't adapted to things like 1,000-pound shells. A gun could fire a shell that's the size of a car, bigger than a Matisse, and that could land beside you and blow up a group of people or a machine or one of your own weapons, equipment. It could easily, blow off legs and arms and that sort of stuff. Just horrible levels of damage. And this is all compacted into sort of 4 years of European struggle. It is called World War I, but most of it happens in Europe. The worst parts of it happen in Europe, whereas World War II is a true global war. The great thing about it for scholarship is that you can kind of see things go in like horses and bright uniforms and completely disappear. And by 1918, the way that people are behaving, the way that people are organized, what they wear, the types of technology they use has completely changed. At the beginning of the war, airplanes are just used for observing. People are flying by, and the Germans are waving, and the British are waving, and the French are waving to each other, and they go by each other. And then, almost week by week or month by month, they try to do stuff like, they go by each other, and then one of them has a gun and fires a shot at one, and then the next time the other team has a gun too, and then they start trying to drop grenades or drop bombs on people, and then they start mounting guns on their airplanes, and then they put machine guns on it so they can fire a lot of shots. And then by the end of the war, airplanes are flying around shooting each other all the time. It's part of warfare that it didn't really exist. Blimps could drop bombs, and it wasn't just for observation or travel anymore. It was a weapon. So this is what World War I represents for us. The Americans missed most of it. They came in right at the end and made a big difference, a big impact on the Allies' side, and allowed the French and the British to defeat Germany. So this is what we're talking about today. We've just talked about modernism, and I want to get into the American century and how one essay I read a long time ago, it's this book right here that I believe I got it from. It's called The Cambridge Companion to Modern American Literature, and it's a collection of essays by really accomplished professors from around the world. And one professor, this is what he does. He just discusses how to look at modern American culture by breaking down the 20th century. And he simplified it in a way that I never could. So I've borrowed it ever since, and I put it in my textbook. It's also a reference in the back of the textbook if you ever want to take a peek. It's not a cheap book. So if you ever wanted to have a look at part of it or something, you just have to ask me. I doubt it's in our library, to be honest. It's my personal copy. So, contrary to what happened in Europe with all the other great powers except for Japan, some historians say the only real winners in World War I were the United States and Japan, because when Germany was defeated, Japan just took over its East Asian territories, in China and stuff. They just grabbed them from, and they took advantage of course, we know this very well in Korea. They took advantage of the weakening of all these powers and the damage and the distraction to annex Korea in 1910 and formally and make it part of the Japanese Empire. And by the time the war was over, there wasn't anybody who wanted to start a war with Japan. First of all, everybody was sick of fighting. And second of all, how are they going to even do it, right? They didn't have money or soldiers or equipment to attack. It was going to take you know, a massively expensive and arduous effort by America about 35 years later, right, 1945. Finally, that would be the result that a much more powerful and developed America would be able to take down Japan. But the only country that could have done that really was the United States. Maybe Russia, but they had the fleet, they had the Navy and the airplanes in order to do that. So going back, the period that I'm going to talk about first, that I have been talking about, is actually in America. It's the exact opposite of Europe, where 1914 is a complete disaster. Millions of people die. Infrastructure is obviously damaged, and economies are shattered, and Germany is punished, and France and the British Empire win, and they gain some territory. Actually, the British Empire actually gets bigger, but it's weaker. It's bigger, but it's weaker. It's less financially stable, and it doesn't have. I mean, the military scales down right after World War I. It's the biggest military that the British have ever had, and after the war, they demobilize it and send everybody home. It leaves scars on everybody, because everybody knows somebody who was there, who died, who was injured, killed, disappeared. Everybody knows somebody. So the whole generation is kind of mentally affected by that. But the Americans are not. The American army was big, but it only fought in the war for basically less than a year. So they went to Europe, they won, and they came back. And there was victory parades and everything. The whole time that the British and the French were at war with Germany, and the Russians in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy was involved too. There was pretty much every major power was fighting. The British were the richest nation in the world. They had an empire that went from Australia to Canada to South Africa and the British Isles. They had an immense amount of territory and people. India was still a part of the British Empire too, and they spent incredible amounts of money. They sent money to Russia to help them. They spent money on equipment and supporting everyone. They were the bankers of the whole situation, but they actually started to run out of money. So they borrowed money from the United States. And they borrowed the money from the United States because they were buying so much equipment. The economy in the United States had been not very healthy since the 1890s. They had a depression in the 1890s that was very severe, and they had a stock market crash in 1893, and things were not going very well until the war started in 1914, and the demand for everything, for food and for guns and leather and helmets and equipment and uniforms and ordnance and gunpowder and everything. Originally they were selling to the Germans too. They weren't just selling to the French and the British until things changed. We can't talk about all the details, but basically the Americans were actually able to profit from both sides at the beginning. So their economy was on fire essentially. And they underwrote the debt of the British. So you can just imagine kind of like a giant vacuum cleaner over top of London, just sucking money out. Every day, $75 million was being spent on this war effort, and a lot of that money was going into New York City. Similar things have happened, not that there's a war, but in the last 40 years or so, when China started manufacturing and China industrialized, that the Americans, basically, you could just imagine a gigantic vacuum cleaner over top of New York and it landing in Beijing, and Shanghai is the stock market, but you can see how financially China's sort of on stronger footing than the United States is for a lot of reasons, but one of the fundamental reasons is because the demand of their goods. China became the world factory. Think about that, because everything's made in China. In World War I, everything was made in America. Everything. Made in America was a thing. It's hard for me to imagine because hardly anything's made in America, right? Even iPhones are an American product, but they're not made in America. They're made in China, but it's an American company. But American doesn't make its own stuff. And I'm not going to say whether that's a good thing or not, but 100 years ago, America made everything. In the 1920s, all the cars on the planet, right? All of the cars everywhere, 5 out of every 6 cars was built in America. There's never been anything like that in the history of the world, where like one product that everybody would eventually have just got manufactured in one place. Like globally, it was all made in America. We do have similar types of dominance, but 5 out of every 6, we're talking about 85% of all cars being made in one country. It's pretty ridiculous. So that's what it was. Made in America, and made in China has, China dominates a lot of different things. Electronics, almost everything is made in China as well. So I could be lying there. There might be certain, types of industry that China dominates now in the same way that America did then. So this is why we call it optimistic, right? It's early optimism because it's the beginning of the 20th century and everything looks good. Everybody's making tons of money. Everybody has a job. America's on strong footing. All the other countries are damaged, but not them. So going into the 1920s, things were going really well. In 1920, there was still fighting going in Russia. The Russian Revolution was happening, and the whites and the reds were fighting, and the communists would win. Various places around the world, things were not going well, but America, it's called the Roaring Twenties because they were roaring like an engine. Just went in there. And if you see pictures of the 1920s, you usually see a lot of people smoking these long cigarettes and fancy clothes and white gloves and dancing around in bars and pianos playing and stuff. Looks like everybody's like it's misrepresentative, but it looks like everybody's partying all the time. And we're in 2020 where we're not allowed to have parties. So the crazy thing though is that in 1918 and 1919, there was this thing called the Spanish flu. And I encourage you to look it up because going to the 1920s, the Spanish flu was gone. So maybe we will have a party next year. Everybody will have a party and everybody will be wanting, maybe that'll be the attitude because we've been stuck inside for so long. But don't do it yet. We don't have the vaccine yet. But in the Spanish flu's case, there was no vaccine yet. There was no treatment for it. We couldn't develop vaccines the way we do now. And even now, people are concerned that the vaccine's being made too quickly, right? So there was no vaccine for the Spanish flu. Instead, it ripped through America. In fact, it went across the entire world and it killed more people than World War I. Some people say it killed as many as 50 million people, which would make it, not as deadly as World War II, but as deadly as the Black Death and other things. Not percentage-wise, because there's more people in the world, but hundreds of thousands of people died. Now, the coronavirus is not over yet, but the percentage of people that died from the Spanish flu in America were higher. If you type in America Spanish flu in Google and you look at pictures, search 1918 Spanish flu, America mask, okay? And look at the images, and it'll be strange to you to see the American great-grandfathers wearing masks. And I saw one the other day. I was looking through stuff because we were talking about contradictions, right? American contradictions. It doesn't mean that it actually doesn't exist. It means contradictions happen all the time, right? Things that shouldn't happen and shouldn't be together are together. Wouldn't you think that more educated modern people would wear masks easier than people in 1918? It doesn't look like it by the pictures because you can see military parades and you can see all people outside. Every single person's wearing a mask. And of course, now we have videos and everything, so maybe people in the countryside, nobody was wearing it. But you see San Francisco or New York or something, and everybody's wearing a mask. I don't know how well it represents mask wearing, but I saw one the other day that a woman had a mask and on it said, "Wear a mask or go to jail." So maybe some things never change, I guess, or maybe it's a contradiction. If you're still writing your paper, it's for you to decide and argue that it is or it isn't. So that's all the early optimism. The optimism gets out of control. Now, I can't explain exactly why this happened, except that capitalism goes through cycles, and periodically there are periods of depression. Basically, there's a cycle of increase. There's a boom, and demand is high, and for various reasons. Sometimes it's natural disasters. Sometimes everybody has the market saturated with something, or there's various supply problems, or trade relationships or break down. There's all kinds of reasons why demand can slip, and then the amount of money starts to dry up. In this case, basically there were a lot of banks, and there were fundamental problems with agriculture. And the demand and the production and the demand were sort of diverging from each other, and people were making a lot of money investing, and stocks were one of those things. People weren't saving a lot of money. They were putting everything in the stock market, because who wants to get 2% from the bank when you can get 20% from a stock? So everybody was investing and everybody was making money. And eventually everybody who saw their neighbor making, it's just like I feel now. Like, there's always somebody I know who's like, I bought this house, and this, the price of my house doubled in 5 years. It's great. I'm like, man, I should have bought it when the timing was perfect. But then you say, no, I'll wait. And then you wait a couple more years and the housing price goes up again. And you wait a couple more years and the housing price goes up again. So the timing thing is very difficult to gauge. And if somebody's making money and constantly, doing well, and you get that information, eventually you might cave, especially through, a period of like 10 years. You're making money, you're not saving much, so you withdraw your savings and you put it in the stocks. And then if you're like me, that's in 1929, and then 1 month later, the stock market crashes and you lose all your money. The 1920 New York stock market crash is known as Black Monday, and there was a Black Tuesday that was even blacker the next day, but it lost close to 30% of its value in the early part of the week's trading, and that was a signal that the economy was sick. Now, in England, the London stock market had already crashed a month before, so there was lots of warning, but people were like, no, it's a European issue, it's not going to affect us. But it did. They were in the same situation. Germany was weak because they were paying reparations, and they were being sort of controlled and suppressed because of their defeat in World War II. That's one of the reasons why Hitler was able to take over, because the economic conditions in Germany were so bad. They were dealing with something called hyperinflation, where the value of their money just evaporated. So they literally had to, if they wanted to buy bread, they had to bring like a bucket full of cash in order to buy some bread, because the stuff was worthless. They were using it to start fires and keep themselves warm, because that was cheaper than actually buying firewood or charcoal, or not charcoal, or coal, to heat their houses. So this is the environment that we call the Great Depression. America was hit just as hard as everywhere else in Europe. Similar story across all of the Western world. Certainly places like China and Japan and Korea, things were not good either. In America, the unemployment rate was close to 1 in every 3 people. It was close to 30% of the population not having a job, which is, we refer to that as like Great Depression levels. The coronavirus has caused a lot of people to lose their jobs, but we're not at that level yet. And hopefully we will not be, because the Depression continued throughout that whole decade. And despite the fact that a really capable president named FDR took over and invested a lot of money in social service, social assistance, and infrastructure programs and government, investment in employment and assistance to citizens. He was not able to turn around the economy and heal it until World War II happened, and the demand for equipment and weapons and machines in World War II was so great that it created another boom, an economic boom, which turned the economy around completely. And basically the unemployment, at the end of World War II, unemployment was essentially zero. Everybody had a job. If you wanted a job, they needed you. They were short on labor. Everybody was working, men, women, old, young people. Everybody was working as much as they could in order to win the war. So that's where they finally overcame the Depression. Now this is called the Greatest Generation for a reason. This is the greatest generation of Americans because they were born in the 20s, and then they grew up in the Great Depression. And my grandfather was one of these people, by the way, and he's Canadian, but he was born in 1923. So he was, at the beginning of the war, he was 16. The young men who were fighting, they were born in the during World War I or in the early 1920s, and they experienced the extreme deprivation of the Depression, like not having enough to eat a lot of the time. My grandfather hated certain foods. Turnips is one of them because they're so cheap and easy to grow, and we used to eat them at Christmas time, but he was always disgusted by them because when he was young, sometimes that's all he ate. He would have breakfast and it was turnips. That's it. No variety, just enough, for him and his 6 brothers and sisters. There were 7 in his family, in like a 2-bedroom house, to eat, and then his dad go to work. That's what people had to live through. And then they fought in World War II and beat Hitler and Imperial Japan. That's a pretty good resume. If you were one of those people, if you grew up and you're extremely poor and you survived and then you fought in World War II and survived that and defeated the Germans and freed the world, essentially, that's a good start. I mean, I can't say that I've done anything that important in my entire life. So, and I'm 39, so I have some catching up to do. So that's why we call them the Greatest Generation, because there were millions of these men and women who had to go through these things, and they survived, and they thrived when they came back. They got jobs and they raised families, and their children had a much better life because of their sacrifices. So that's the Great Depression, which brings us to the liberal consensus. And now remember, this is just a sort of framework for sort of understanding the sequence of the developments. So America's doing great. We're awesome. Everybody's optimistic. Everything looks positive. They slam into the Depression and they realize that everything isn't going to be good forever, and we shouldn't overestimate and have too high expectations about anything: economics, survival, education, or life. We shouldn't take these things for granted. It's a sort of a reality check. And then they win World War II and come back. But during World War II, they basically have to put aside political differences and work with each other. They have a Democratic president, and lots of Republicans and conservatives don't really like him. But he's winning the war, and he's managing the country so effectively that during World War II, democracy works. They give and take, they compromise, and this is why it's called the liberal consensus, because basically they say, yes, what's more important, we need to win the war, and we need to reward people, and we need to help people. So socialism isn't a horrible thing, right? Programs, government spending, and government control, we're just going to be liberal on most subjects in order to achieve victory and to build a country that's strong enough to resist both Japan and Germany at the same time, with, of course, Russia and the United Kingdom's help. Those two are the other two major factors, along with Canada and Australia, New Zealand, and a bunch of other countries too, that played major roles. But those are the big three, especially America and Russia, and then the United Kingdom being the third. The liberal consensus keeps going sort of into the 1950s after, believe it or not, even in World War II, we talked about slavery earlier, all of these practices have been made illegal a long time ago, but in certain states they still don't allow black people to vote, and they still keep black people and white people separate. And one of those institutions that still does this until World War II is the military. So you have all these, you don't have white American soldiers and black American soldiers mixed together in the same units. They have separate units. This sounds like an ancient idea, but that's what I mean about modernism still hanging on to some of these old-fashioned ideas that were really common in a lot of places in Europe for hundreds of years, but really we would never imagine trying to do that. But they had Japanese units, Japanese Americans had their own units, and African Americans had their own units, because the Japanese, they didn't want them fighting against their former, ethnic group. Their ethnic group, but their former countrymen, their ancestors lived in the same place, and they might be able to, spy or betray. So they're allowed to fight, but they have to fight in Germany, and they actually fight very well, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, I should say. Not surprisingly, because the Japanese army was a dangerous group in World War II. But the African Americans also, they're supposed to be. Integration happens during the war, and after the war, integration finally happens. And this is another sort of liberal idea, is that we need to get rid of these old ideas that don't work anymore and get rid of them. And the liberal consensus allows politicians to do that. Going into the 1960s, some of these things at home, like the fact that the African Americans fight on behalf of democracy and defeat Hitler and Imperial Japan, where there was no democracy and no voting, and they come home and they can't vote, you can see this is a contradiction. So as I said to one of my students last week, one of the things that when you're thinking about a contradiction, what's important is that sometimes these contradictions cause a lot of friction. Like, there's a lot of problems in any country, but America seems to have these built-in things that are definitely it's like a ticking time bomb. Like when you write the Constitution and you say everybody's free, if they're human, they're free. It's a natural right. But some people are not real humans because they're slaves. Like that's a contradiction. You can't do that. You can't just say everybody's human, everybody has the right to be free, and then accept some people. There's no exception there. It's kind of going to be a problem sooner or later. And going into the 1960s, everybody could see that this existed. This contradiction existed. This racial contradiction existed, and there were other groups that were being discriminated against too. So this is what the civil rights movement is, and it's another crisis. So you have period, crisis, and Martin Luther King Jr. Is a famous name. Malcolm X. There are many. Rosa Parks. These are household names now about the people that took risks. And Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were killed. Took great risks and were very brave in order to achieve, civil rights. Gained things for citizens that they were not allowed to have. They were searching for equality, right? They were trying to make it so citizens of all types would not be discriminated against from birth. So the there was massive protests, and there was government resistance, and there was different sorts of, conflicts between different types of people. But Martin Luther King was a reverend. He was a religious man, and he believed in sort of passive resistance, like Gandhi or like Jesus. That he would the best solution was to not resist and not fight. There were dangerous groups, but for the most part, every time racist people attacked Martin Luther's protests, they just made themselves look worse and crazier to everyone, because they basically trained themselves not to be aggressive and not to resist actively against these people, almost not to defend themselves physically or protect themselves. So it just, every time that was on the news, they gained sympathy from the majority of people. And in the end, they gained a lot of rights. Some of those things have sort of, you can see these days with the Black Lives Matter movement, that some of these things still need to be improved. But that wasn't a great achievement in the 1960s, that they gained some of these things like integrated schools and non-segregated, public spaces, which is obviously a necessary achievement. But Jackie Robinson was a baseball player. There weren't black athletes in a lot of sports. They weren't on the Olympic team. They were excluded from so many things, and the civil rights movement made it clear that that shouldn't be the way that it is. Okay, finally we get to my least favorite era, which is the era I was born in. Into the 1970s and 80s, there was a shift in America towards a more conservative approach. All politicians from Ronald Reagan onward have this kind of lean, or at least moderate conservative element to their leadership. It doesn't matter if you're talking about Bill Clinton or Barack Obama or the Bushes or Reagan or Donald Trump. He's a little bit different, and we're not going to be able to talk about him too much in this class. Maybe in Zoom next Thursday, but I'm not going to get into that because it's so fresh and it's a dangerous topic to refer to, and until everything has settled, I think, about that situation. But Obama I can certainly use as an example, that although he seems like a very liberal type person, but in practice his policies are very moderate, right? And so there has always been a left, right? What we call the leftists. And there's been far left and far right in these various positions in politics. Like I said, the liberal consensus was dominant in the war years and shortly after that, into the 1950s. And that's because at that point, Eisenhower, who was a general, he kind of continued the practice of being liberal in many of his policies, keeping tax rates high. He was fiscally conservative, but sort of liberal in the sense that he allowed all the changes to continue, and that he didn't undo what the liberal consensus had already done. And that's what a conservative person might try to do, like Donald Trump, is try to roll back things that a previous president had done. And that's the key difference about Donald Trump from the others, I think, is almost everything that Barack Obama tried to do, Donald Trump tried to undo. And that's something that's some presidents do that. It's not the first time. He's not unique, and we shouldn't pretend that Donald Trump is unique, because there's been lots of presidents who have been elected, and the first thing they try to do is fix everything they think the last president did wrong. That's happened quite a few times, but just not recently. So this, again, it's kind of like the consensus that everybody agrees that we're going to be a little bit more conservative. This means the new conservative era. One of the things I can point to is basically the militaristic aspect of America. This is another contradiction, I think, because America seems to talk about out of one side of its mouth, it says, "Oh yeah, we love peace and freedom and democracy, leaders of the free world," and out of the other side of their mouth, they say, "Oh yes, but we have the biggest weapons and the biggest guns and the newest technology, and if you do something wrong, we're going to blow up your country." I shouldn't say it that simple. It's not that simple. They're not going to blow up your country, but I mean they do bomb. That is blowing up part of the country. They claim to be very precise with their targets and everything, but there's always victims in war, and you can't control who's losing their buildings and who's losing their jobs and all that kind of stuff. Who can't eat? They can't control all those factors. So when they go somewhere, they're basically intervening. We call them it's hyper intervention. Wherever there's a problem in the world, the United States goes there and either arbitrates between the two groups or they attack or defend. They've been doing it since World War II, off and on, but they tend to do it more so recently. And Obama, you can't call him liberal in that sense, because he certainly has been he's a hawk. What we call a hawk is somebody who favors military behavior, and Donald Trump really isn't. He's fairly random, but he hasn't attacked any countries, and he hasn't been doing any military buildups. He's actually withdrawing some soldiers in some cases, and Obama sort of maintained the level of military activity in the world that Bush and Clinton and Bush Sr. and Reagan and Carter and so on had continued since going back to the Vietnamese War and to the Korean War. So what we have is the neocon era, where there's these certain elements. Excuse me. There's no elephants, although the Republican Party symbol is an elephant. So it is actually neoconservative elephants. But they have these. If you look in the textbook, you can see it's going to mention. Where we go? Which page is it? The neocons and the bipartisan consensus. That's page 237. So you're going to have to read up on this stuff. This lecture is getting close to an hour. I haven't had a lecture that is this long this semester, so this is. I apologize for it being so long, but we're trying to squeeze in some stuff at the end of the semester, and most students said they preferred the video lecture over the Zoom lecture. A lot of students said, "Oh, it's easier to study, or I can stop and start it when I want," that sort of thing. So I've basically said all I can say without making it a crazy long lecture, and I intend on doing one more video lecture about the second half of chapter 7, and usually chapter 8 ends up being sort of a discussion. So we're going to do that on Zoom. And in addition to talking about review, questions that people have and that sort of thing, right? Obviously, when we're on Zoom, we're going to talk about the exam. And of course, all of we should be clear, the exam is on December 10th. It's at 10 o'clock in the morning. All of us are going to write at the same time, but because of social distancing, you need to have your desks farther apart. So we can't fit into one room. So there's going to be older students who are going to write upstairs. So there'll be about 20 students upstairs in room 456, and then the remaining 30 students will be downstairs in room 124. I'm going to post a list of the whole class with your name and where your location is. So you can look at that spreadsheet. It's going to also include some scores when I put it up there. Probably the first version will just have the locations, and then I'm going to add stuff to it. I'll be taking the spreadsheet down and then uploading a new one so that you can see your scores over the semester, how you did on the assignments, and where you're going to rate the exam. Okay, so there's a note on the website that describes what's happening on the exam, so please read it over. If you were not clear, basically the multiple choice is about the whole semester. The best way to study for the stuff from the first semester, I was saying, is that read your first 3 quizzes. I'm not saying that the quizzes are going to only the first 3 quizzes. I'm just recommending that you use the first 3 quizzes to study, because that'll make it easier. The last 3 questions will be from only the American stuff, and but there'll be roughly 10 questions from the first half of the semester, because I don't want you to forget everything. So make sure you look over your first 3 quizzes before the exam, just to refresh your memory on those 30 questions, because I'm going to draw most of the questions that I remake for the exam from those 3. And that's it. Thank you for listening to this long lecture. Feel free to just listen to this in parts, right? You don't have to listen to it all at once. I'm going to do another one that's probably going to be about this length too. Hopefully more like 40 minutes, but you got to do what you got to do. This is what we would do in the real class. Sometimes the lecture goes over break time a little bit, so this is how it would be in the real class. That's it. Have a good evening, and expect one more video lecture, one main one, and I might throw in a short little review video lecture after we have Zoom on Thursday. Have a good night.